Cool. So, uh, kind of like again using our order of operations guide here, we're chucking through, right? We made it through part one. Um, that was really just building and setting up and planning our Rails API, right? As the first step. We don't want to do anything in JavaScript. We don't really want to move forward with code at all until we're super clear on the project we're building, what the user stories are and those relationships on associations. And then in part two, we were like, okay, we got the kind of bare bones of our API. Now we're going to look at setting up our routes, controllers, and serializers. And we did all that good stuff in part two. And then again, as a reminder, part three, now that we have an API set up and we saw those JSON endpoints, that JSON being rendered in our endpoints in our last session, we're now in a really good place to move on to our front end functionality. And for that, we're actually going to go ahead and pull up those notes. And I'll be sure to kind of like copy these notes in the repo once we build it. But I first, again, like we've been doing, kind of addressing things that came up in the last session. We're going to make sure we circle back around and close that loop. And I want to shout out William here. I kind of alluded to that this morning, or not this morning, earlier, when everyone was trickling in. But if you recall, we kind of had like a 20-minute, 15-minute discussion about why it is important to reference our foreign keys and reference that belongs to association, mainly for the efficiency of our database, right? Mainly, it was kind of like a speed issue. And we linked in part two to like ways and places you can read more about that. But then I mentioned something in there saying that we're going to need to delete null false so that our migration will be successful. When I did this, I was getting this like Postgres error, and I kind of like Googled it. This was my mistake. This is kind of like one of the pitfalls we can fall into as programmers. I like Googled my error, and then I saw something that kind of like affirmed what I thought may have been wrong. And I was like, okay, that's what's wrong. Like, I can't do this with Postgres. And I found a Stack Overflow article that like confirmed that for me in my head. But I was wrong. I was totally wrong. And I linked to where exactly I was wrong in that previous video. Shout out to William. I believe he's with us. William, I hope I'm saying your last name right. William Barella.
That's great.
Yes, cool. Love when this happens. So I actually love being wrong, because as a teacher, right, when you stop learning, that's just sad. So William shouted us out and was like, let me let this person in. Someone just, Renika's trying to come in. He mentioned that essentially this is because we already had C data in our database before we were adding this reference. And I want to actually pull up his quote here, because he really broke this down really well. And William, feel free to also jump in since you're here. But I think the biggest piece that he said is like, I think it's important that we have a foreign key reference be a non-null to ensure the integrity of the database. That is absolutely right. That's absolutely spot on. Well, did you want to speak more about this? I feel like this is such a good call out.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, actually, I ran into this issue about 20 minutes before I had my review for Rails, because I needed to actually link up a table with the users, and so I was panicking. But at the end of the day, of course, if you have a table with if you have a table that depends upon another I guess on another table. So if it essentially has a foreign key to that, you definitely want to have a reference to it, because if that's null, you have no way of really cleaning out your database to delete all the associated items that are linked to the parent table. So, but that's it. But I appreciate you mentioning this anyway.
Of course, I appreciate you like literally being like, you know what? Actually, like I had the same exact problem. This is how I fix it. And like let's circle back on this because this is super important. So for the folks who like have been building their database based on this project review, just like I did, go ahead and roll back that migration. And then what you'll do is you can do this. This also was sent from William. Like you can in your Rails console add this snippet of code. This is what he ended up doing. What I ended up doing was the syllabus.all, same thing. Kind of like borrowing from his code there. But doing this, I was able to, like William said, successfully execute that migration here. So if I look at, where am I? My database, and I look at my migration, right? I see that I now have that null false, right? Making sure I will not have non-null values on my foreign keys. So this is for my foreign keys, I should say. So this is super important. I was able to get that implemented, and then I was able to right now we have that protection here. So just a quick note, because as we're building this project build, right, we're asking questions and we're addressing things that may happen in previous sections, and we're closing the loop with each session. So I want to make sure we also close that loop and that we shouted out William here, because really it's like people like that, folks like that, doing things like that, that the developer community is so strong with Medium articles and Stack Overflow help and answers and all of those things. So thanks, William, and thank you all for being here. Yeah, like thank you all for like being a part of the journey, right? We're all learning here. So anyone have any questions about all that goodness that was just mentioned? Cool. All right. So let's go ahead and get started. Now that we kind of are familiar with the updates to our database, we're going to move into part 3. Part 3, as I mentioned, is going to be, yes, everyone, plus William in the chat. Part 3, as I mentioned, is going to be JavaScript, mainly focusing on JavaScript. And I really want to share something, a mantra that my JavaScript instructor taught me, Anne, over in the DC campus. When we were first learning JavaScript, for me, there were a lot of moving parts. And when it came to putting it all together, I was just like, oh, wait, okay, events somewhere, fetching somewhere, somehow, and I'm updating the DOMs somewhere, somehow. So this mantra was really grounding for me. And she wrote on the whiteboard, when some event happens, I want to make what kind of fetch and manipulate the DOM in what way. If you've seen me give the lecture for fetching, you've heard this mantra before, but this has been super grounding for me, and it was grounding for me when I was first learning JavaScript. So a lot of JavaScript concepts are thrown out or thrown to y'all, but really to build a single page application, you're going to want to get comfortable with DOM manipulation, one concept, event handling and listening, one concept, events, we can just call it, and then fetching, right? Communicating with some sort of server to get some sort of data if you want to attach your front end to a back end. Those 3 concepts are kind of like the 3 pillars we should hold in our head when building out our JavaScript project. And that's exactly what we're going to be using this mantra throughout building, kind of like doing this loop of events, fetching, and then DOM manipulation. Events, fetching, DOM manipulation. And I also want to quickly shout out how JavaScript is going to be very, very different than Rails, right? As y'all probably already know that being in the JavaScript section. But, and I have a quick note here, and I kind of borrowed this text from the JavaScript API setup repo, but Rails is very, very opinionated. Rails has a very set structure. It's following MVC. It is very, very opinionated about how you design and lay out your API, your Rails backend. With JavaScript, none of those rules really apply. How you decide to design your file structure and design your project directory is going to be totally up to you. I'm sure some of y'all have already seen Cernan's video about how he goes through building a modular front end. You can do it that way, right? If you want an adapter for your fetch request, if you want some modularity in there, then you can do it that way. But you can also just have an index.js file that's doing all of your fetching and DOM manipulation all in one file. In part 3, we'll move into refactoring our JavaScript code into OOJS. But I really wanted to first call that out, that there's no like quote unquote right or wrong way to build out your front end. But we'll talk about kind of like best practices and convention throughout this session, and then also in part 4 as well as we wrap up. Cool. So now that we kind of have grounded ourselves in what we're about to do, we're actually going to get started. So what we're gonna first do is create a separate directory for our front end. For me, that means, so like, let me first kind of show y'all how I'm working through that here, and I give you some kind of shortcuts that we can use here. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up my terminal and walk through how I do that. So let's go ahead and share this. Okay, so right now I am in the CETA syllabus backend project directory. Can make this a little bigger. But really, I want to be in here because this is where I'm actually going to make that new directory. I call it the backend CETA syllabus backend. I'm now going to call this CETA syllabus front end. If you're just joining us, then CETA is something I decided to name this application. When I'm building out projects, I like to give it little names because it just makes it funner and feel more official. So making that directory, I can do this from the command line like this. This command is short for make directory. All right, and now I should be able to cd into this new directory, but it's currently empty, right? So if I were to look at that over here, get my windows out the way.
So Ayana, just to clarify, because that confused me at first, and I'm sure if it confused me, I'm not sure, but if it confused me, it could have confused other people. So yes. Since that was all local, you had your CETA syllabus backend repo in a local folder on your computer called JS.
Yep.
And so now you just created a separate repo called CETA syllabus front end. So they're not linked yet at all.
No, okay. No, not at all. So, right, the backend has all of my API files here. Basically, this is my whole entire Rails project. If I collapse that, I see right under it, and I'm sorry this is confusing for y'all, but I basically just do, I have all my study groups in this JS.
I saw JS, and I'm like, wait a second, what?
No, this is, I have a JS folder, I have a Rails folder, so, and a Sinatra folder as well. So I basically do it based on sections, but y'all can have it however you want. Maybe you have a Flatiron folder, maybe you have a JS folder too. But now in that JS folder, that top level project directory, I have kind of a subfolder called CETA syllabus on the same level as my CETA backend directory. And in there, I want to actually create some files, right? Like currently it's empty. There's nothing happening. That arrow is pointing down, but it's not showing anything. So what I'm going to do is I can do, now that I'm in that directory, I can do touch, which will create a new file for me. And I'm going to go ahead and first create my index.html file here. And if I jump back to my directory, I will see that file here. So I'm kind of like, I'm really like, this is progress. Like, you know, it's very little things, but this is kind of the exact first steps to building out our front end. And if you're using Atom, you can just do HTML, press tab. That'll give you some boilerplate HTML. Most text editors do something like this. So if you're following along, just type HTML and type tab or press enter, and it may give you some boilerplate HTML here. But now that we have this front end repo, what I'm also going to do is I'm going to give y'all, I'm trying to figure out what's the best way to do this. So I want to give y'all these notes as soon as possible, but I'll do it on our first Git push. So we now have this HTML file. Let's see what our next step is, kind of following in line with our order of operations here. So I created a separate directory for the front end, right? I'm now on step 2 where I need to create my index.html file, but I have not yet actually added that script tag. So I'm going to borrow that script tag here and copy it. I'm going to jump back to my index.html file. There's a lot of debate of whether we should put this file in this script tag in the head or the body. Feel free to look up that and go down your own rabbit holes and make your own decisions. I'm going to put it in the head, but folks definitely do either or. And so we have the script tag as a review, right, is what we need to add in our index.html file in order to connect our eventual JavaScript file with this HTML file, right? So this HTML file is going to actually like render the structure of our front end, similar to how our ERB files did in Rails, but instead of kind of like having to refresh and show a new HTML or a new ERB file every time, we're going to use JavaScript to kind of like manipulate that HTML structure and update that HTML structure, which is what we call manipulating the DOM, right? So I first created this HTML file. I now have that script tag, and I'm going to go back into my terminal, and I'm going to do touch index.js, right? To get that file. Sonar asked, can I see one more time your command for make directory? So you're super close. It's just mkdir. That's going to be the command that you're going to be able to use to make a new folder. Cool. So we now have that index.js file, hopefully, fingers crossed, and we sure do. What I always like to do is just real quick, the cheap and easy way to just make sure that I'm not building a fetch request and doing all these things in this folder, and I spelled index wrong in my script tag and nothing is connected, and I'm like scratching my head and trying to find out why. So out of habit, I do this, and I am going to open up my index, make sure that that is all hooked up as expected. I really need to get 2 monitors at some point in my life. All right, cool. So, cool. All right, so we now are in that index.js file. For all of the folks who are currently working on a 2-monitor situation, I envy you. I have so many windows open right now, but I'm like super picky and want a very specific monitor. So anyway, that's a whole nother story. We now are connected in the index.js file. We're looking good. All systems are pretty much go here. So let's take a look at where we are in our order of operations. 1 through 3 looks done, right? So let's go ahead and check that off. What do we think our kind of like our next step is going to be? Now that we have our index.html file created, our separate repo created, we know everything's now connected. What should be our very next step here?
Initialize or get repo.
Yes.
Yeah.
Who was that? That's exactly right.
William.
Yes, that's exactly right. So we now have all this up. We really need to set up a Git repo, and I need to. That's the very next step, but I don't yet have this in here. So we're going to do. Let's go back in here. And let's do initialize. Here we go. That's exactly right. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to navigate to Chrome, and I am going to create a new repository. So I already have one. If we go back, I already have a repo called CETA syllabus backend. I'm going to use the same exact name structure. I'm going to do CETA syllabus frontend. Cool. I can be public. I want y'all to see it. That's fine. I'm not going to initialize it with a README. I guess I could. No, I'm not going to. Eventually initialize it, like eventually create a README. We could initialize it with a README in this case because with Rails gives us a README. This would give us problems if we did initialize the README with Rails. But I'm just going to create my own README later on. I'm going to hit create repository. It is created. And because it is already existing, we already created that repo. I'm going to use this code here, where I'm just going to add the remote, and I'm going to push it. In part 1, I believe we kind of like broke down this step and with a finer tooth comb. But since we've gone through it before, we're going to kind of gloss through this super quickly. So I've created that repository in GitHub, but I haven't yet initialized it here. Can you put the 2 repos under one parent repo? I do not recommend doing that. So that kind of defeats the whole purpose of why we're doing 2 separate repos in the first place. Just want to make sure. So the reason why we are doing 2 separate repos is because eventually we may want to deploy this, right? We may want to deploy this project. It is much easier to, for example, deploy your backend repo with only your backend code to something like Heroku, and then deploy your front end repo to something like Netlify, right? And just it be your front end code. There is a way in which you can submit a repo that has both the front end and the back end to something like Heroku. It's just kind of a headache. So I would recommend having them be 2 separate repositories. If you've already did your project and you have them in like one parent repo and there's 2 folders in there, that's fine, especially for this program. But just know if you want to, let's say after you graduate, you want to actually deploy this project, you're going to have to do some extra steps to deploy those two separate repos there. Does anyone have any questions about that? It looks like way too many eyes. Let me check the chat. Okay, cool. We did our push. Let's do our push now. Was it origin? I can't remember. There it is. Okay. Sweet. So we just pushed that code up. And now when we go back to that repo, we should see that those kind of initial files here. What I'm also going to do is I'm going to add, as promised, kind of in the beginning, the notes. Where are we? The notes in here. So I'm going to do new file, and let's do part 3. Perfect. Notes, MD. All right, and those will be in here. I'll just go ahead and borrow that from here. So I'm kind of juggling back and forth just to get y'all these notes so that as you're following along, you can kind of follow along with these. So I'm going to do another push real quick, and then I'll share out this new repo with y'all. Added notes. I'm gonna push that up here. Cool. All right, so you now should have our part 3 notes here that we're going to be using to walk through this. And I am going to add this repo to the chat so y'all can follow along. Cool. All right, so we've done all of kind of like the initial setup stuff here. I also want to bring this over as well now that we have this repo. I'm just going to add the MD. I'm just going to bring this over as well. All right. So, do Markdown preview. All right, we are kind of rocking and rolling here. We've done this step. We've initialized the new repo. And now I feel like we're in a good spot to actually start building out some JavaScript here, right? So we've done all of our initial setup stuff. I'll reorder these. But again, let's think about what our JS mantra is here. When we think about the very, very first thing we want to do with our application, we can think about that JS mantra, right? When some event happens, what's the first event that happens in JavaScript when a page loads?
On load.
Yeah. The DOM loads, right? And it's often called DOM content loaded, which is kind of a listener that we can add. So when some event happens, the DOM content is loaded. I want to make what kind of fetch? Usually, yeah, exactly, Connie. Usually a get. Like usually I just want to get some data, show the user some data. It would be a very, very confusing website, right? If the user came to our website and didn't see anything yet. I mean, there is a world in which our very first page can be our login form if we're doing auth. So there's things like that. Maybe a user needs to like create something or authenticate themselves before they can see the rest of the data. But if we're just doing a plain old single page application without auth, usually we want to show the user some data initially. And then manipulate the DOM in what way? Probably want to render that data. There's all kinds of things you can do after you make a get fetch and have some data, but usually we want to render it. So this is kind of like the loop we're going to follow to actually connect our API to the front end and get started on that first fetch request. But now that I have an index.html file and an index.js file that we know is connected, how would I start to build out that event listener for my DOM content loaded, right? Let's say I wanted to just console log once the DOM has been loaded here. What would I start to type? All right, we got somebody in the chat. Yep, that's exactly right, Sushi. So we want, and I'm just realizing I still have all this going on over here. Don't need two of you. All right, cool. Yeah, we want to kind of listen on the document. We want to add an event listener here. And as we said, right, we want to listen for the DOM content being loaded. And we can kind of do an arrow function here. And then I'm going to add the curly so I can make it multi-line. As I mentioned, right, we're just going to log to make sure that this is working as expected. So we're just going to log loaded here. And let me make sure I pull my, where'd my browser go? There it is. Cool. All right, that's working as expected. So we got that working. This is good news. Like, this is going swimmingly, right? So what's next? Again, we can look at our order of operations here. Oh, we're already looking at that.
Do we need to make a fetch request?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So, but before we do that, something that I like to do is just to make sure that the endpoint that we want to make our fetch request to is working, right? So before we do that, let's go ahead and actually spin up our Rails server and make sure we can make a call to that endpoint here. Make this a little smaller. And I'm just going to open up a new tab here and make sure y'all can see that. So I just opened up a new tab, but now I'm going to CD into my backend so that I can I'm just going to do a rake reset as well. And I'm going to run my server here. Cool. So my server is running. Now I'm going to, before I even start trying to fetch to this endpoint, I'm going to make sure it's actually serving me some JSON data. So as we remember, this was what we built out last week. What route am I fetching to here? I went to localhost 3000 API v1 syllabuses. What route is this in my backend?
It's your syllabuses index route.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So in here, last time we built out this controller. There's a lot of comments because we are talking about the different ways in which we can render associated data using our fast JSON API serializer. But we eventually went with this way. It's way less nesting involved, but that nesting that the fast JSON API does can be actually super helpful once the application scales. But since it's kind of small right now, we're just going to render it this way. But we also have that code still in here. Let me make sure I'm looking at the chat. Yeah, everyone's saying index. Y'all are exactly right. So it's pointing to this controller method, but right, this has to be set up in our routes for this to also work. And we have an index and a create only. Again, we are building vertically. I did not add all my routes here and fill out my controller just because, you know, I'm familiar with the different routes. Pattern matching can get us into a lot of trouble because we end up kind of getting lost in our code. So I'm only using my index and create, and the route that I just tested in the browser is my index. I see that this is working. So this is the endpoint which I'm going to fetch from. So let's actually go ahead and do that, right? So we are not in routes anymore. We're in here. How would I start to fetch from that endpoint? Let me grab that URL real quick, y'all. Sorry for jumping back and forth here. How would I start to type that out?
Parentheses and your local host address.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. I can also do something like this and just kind of declare this up above so that I can reuse that as I make fetch requests throughout my code. What do I want to do now?
r.json, r, arrow, r.json.
Yeah, so at first when we say R, right, like we're capturing this response, and then we want to, right, we want to parse that response into JSON. If we remember what fetch returns, it returns a promise. In that promise, there's a response that we can take out and then parse to JSON. What we can then do is actually get access to that JSON data, right? So we can name this JSON. I'm going to name this syllabi. And again, right, we can name this whatever we want. But it should make sense, right? So because I should be getting an array of syllabi back, I'm going to name this syllabi. I went back and forth. Should I be consistent? If syllabus is in the back end, it's syllabi. I can name it whatever I want in the front end. I'm doing syllabi because I can't bear to just write syllabuses if I have a choice. So syllabi, syllabuses, same thing.
Cool.
Can
I ask a question?
For sure.
Can you just remind me and refresh my memory again on the sort of order of operations, the synchronous versus asynchronous nature? Like if you had the function there that was basically like after then syllabi, and then instead of just console logging, if you had something else, you know, would it be impacted or not impacted if you had an error coming back from the server? And how can you mitigate against that?
Yeah, okay, so good question. I think this will become a little bit more clear as we build this out, but if you remember, yes, dot catch, exactly. So I could also, ooh, am I in here? I could also do like a dot catch, which I could catch those errors here. And if you remember, I have, where is my controller? Yeah, syllabus controller. I'm like also rendering my errors in here. So, right, if the syllabus doesn't save, if there's something wrong, I am rendering the errors in the front end. And that is something I'll be able to see in the network tab, right? So let's see, where am I? Index.html, like let's refresh this page. So I'm getting my data back here, but I could also, if this did not come through properly in my network tab, I can look at XHR requests only, click on this, and in the response would be my error. Again, like they said, I could catch that error and like show that error to the user somehow. I can catch that error and decide to do something else. But dot catch is a way I can implement that. And what I can do is I can make a note in our notes here to make sure that in part 4, we circle back around and actually see that implemented, because I think that could be helpful. So let's do, let me move this Zoom bar out my way. Oh, right. So kind of in here, I'm gonna do, we're gonna implement dot catch and handle our errors. That's a good question, Sushi. And I'll make sure we actually like show that in part 4, but really, like they said, dot catch is going to be the way we can kind of do something if there is an error. Show something to the user. Is that helpful?
Yes, thanks.
Cool, of course. All right, so as we just saw in the browser, I'm currently getting some data back, but if y'all have been following along, and if you saw that walkthrough that was passed around in part 1, there is a little allusion to CORS. And that's something I think is going to be important to talk about, because that's often an error that I see people get. In the notes, there's a note about, let me do a markdown preview so it's a little easier to read for y'all. Okay, at some point. All right. In here, I have a note on CORS. CORS stands for Cross-Origin Resource Sharing. There's examples here, but it's a security. It's basically a security thing. Our application, they're named the same. The back end is named CEDA. The front end is named CEDA, but they don't know about each other. They're not friends yet. Like to my Rails application, my front end is still a very, very unknown entity. So in my back end, I had to do a couple of things. I had to first, in my gem file, uncomment this gem, rat CORS. That was the first thing I had to uncomment out to enable cross-origin resource sharing, which is another way of saying, like, who can access this API, who can make calls to this API, who can interact with this API, what website or front or entity can interact with this API. So I had to uncomment this, uncomment this, I should say. And then the other thing I had to do was I had to go to my config, and I had to go to initializers, and in that folder is CORS. Before, all of this code is commented out, right? If this is your first time doing this, your CORS.rb file probably looks something like this, which means if you were just following along and you tried to fetch to your backend, let's see, I need to restart my server because I want to show y'all this error. Alrighty. This is actually, let's see. I restarted my server.
I think it's because you're not running the front end through a server. So the thing is that it's still coming from the same origin because you're on the local host under that, but not using a different port.
Okay, so this is what we'll do. We'll comment this back in, and then we'll only do originsexample.com. So let's see if this works. So basically what this is saying, and this is how it comes, it says example.com. eventually, right, you're going to want to put your own origin. Eventually, this may be like localhost 3000, whatever. But this is something they want you to change. Let's see if this actually shows us that Rails error. I mean, that CORS error. If not, just know there is going to be an error. No, it's not. So yeah, it could be what William's saying. Error handling with JS promises. Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Meg. But it's essentially what we will get is a CORS error here that basically says need to enable cross origin sharing. If you see that, make sure that you in your gem file, where'd it go? Have commented in CORS, but then also in your CORS.rb, that's in the config folder under initializers, have set your origins to like basically accepting calls from anywhere. Eventually, you're going to want to update this. For now, since we're the only people using this API, this is fine. In the future, like I said, you can do localhost, or you can do whatever domain name your front end is hosted at. Anyone have any questions about this? Again, you can like read all about this in the project 3, part 3 project notes. But that's something that comes up a lot in office hours, so I wanted to make sure we devoted at least some time to it. Cool. Okay. So let's move on back to the fun stuff. CORS is fun, but not as fun as actually getting some data, right? So we've created an endpoint, put that on the top of our code, and we are now successfully getting some JSON data. But what I would like to do is I would love to kind of like pull this out into its own function, just to clean this up a little bit. I've seen folks like do their whole entire project in the DOM content loaded. It will work, it will get you far, but it's just not advisable. So what we're going to do, and again, right, this goes back to really being able to having a lot of freedom with decision making in our code. But let's actually kind of take this out, right, and create a get syllabi function, right? Because that's what's happening. We're fetching and getting all of our syllabi, and we're going to create a function for doing just that. And that's where we're going to be doing our fetch. And if we're thinking about our mantra, when some event happens, when the DOM content loads, I want to make what kind of fetch? I'm making a GET request. Making a GET request here. If I go to my Chrome, we see this is still working. If I go to my network tab, I can go to XHR requests and I see this data coming through. See that GET request coming through. What's the last thing I want to do here, right? If we're thinking about that mantra, what should probably happen on line 11? Console logging the syllabus is great, or the syllabi is great, but we want to do something else here.
Don't we need to render it?
Yes, Carrie, we need to render. And I actually have some markup code already created in the notes. I don't think it would be a good use of y'all's time to watch me type HTML, but I will let's like actually go over it because there's a lot of HTML happening here and a lot of code. So I'm going to paste that in. I just pasted in a lot of code. So let's actually like break this down. First step is I'm getting my syllabus array. Since it is an array, I know I'm going to probably want to for each over it or do some sort of iteration, because I'm probably going to want to render these these objects individually. If we recall, our data is nested. So doing syllabi dot for each will not work. Let's see what error we get here. I'm gonna go back to my browser. I'm gonna go to my console, refresh this page. Oh, well, that's a syntax error.
I think like line 25 shouldn't be there. I think there's one too many of those.
Yeah, you're totally right. All right, cool. Yeah, we look like we're in better shape now. Thanks, Meg. All right. So let's now, right, see that error. So syllabi dot for each is not a function. And that's because if we recall how the fast JSON serializer kind of serializes our data, it is in this array that has a key of data, right? So it's not at the top level like it would be if we were just rendering JSON. So in here, I'll need to do syllabi dot data dot for each to actually get to that array. And now what I'm doing is over each syllabus, I am doing something that's not so pretty, but it works. I have a div here, and I want to render its image, its title, its category. And I'm also rendering a button just in case in the future I want to edit this syllabus. I'm going to add its data ID to that button for future edit functionality if that's something I end up choosing to do. I've also added the data ID on the div itself. Couple things happening here. Notice I have syllabus dot attributes. Again, if we remember how the fast JSON API serializes our data, we'll see, yes, we have data in here. So we have our data array, but then within that array, we have individual objects that have an attributes key. In that attributes key is where all of our attributes are living. So if I want to access the title, the description, the image URL, my category association, I have to go down a few levels, right? So I have to use syllabus.attributes. Now, if I want category, I have to kind of go even further and do syllabus.attributes.category, use this key, .name. So I always like to, when I'm working with JSON data on my front end, have a tab open with my JSON data, just so you can know and already always have this reference of how you're going to actually access that data that can be nested sometimes, very nested.
Can you scroll up a little? So it kind of almost looks like wherever there's a drop down.
Yes.
Where you have to put like dot attributes, like data dot attributes dot category.
Yeah, I think that's a good observation. Like, because these arrows kind of point to something that's being nested, right? Which means you can collapse it.
Signifies a nested level.
Exactly. Which is why if you don't already, please download the JSON viewer extension. That is going to help you out a lot when dealing with JSON data here. But cool. Okay, so we have to do syllabus.attributes to get to the image URL, syllabus.attributes to get to the title, and do a little bit more work with category to display this association. And again, this is one of the reasons why I really wanted to talk to y'all about serializers, because we can display the category that this syllabus belongs to by serializing that data. So here we can do syllabus.attributes.category.name. And then what I'm doing here on line 22 is I am finding the syllabus container And then I'm saying, okay, I want to update the inner HTML of that syllabus container with this markup code, with all of this HTML code here. But do I have a syllabus container yet? Right? Like I probably shouldn't have even brought over this code. Does that even exist yet? We go back to our HTML. Is there a syllabus container yet?
No.
Quite. Not quite. Not yet. So let's go ahead and add that div here. We're going to make this a class. If. And then we're going to do syllabus container. And this is where we're going to render all of that data that we get back from our fetch.
Wait, you said we're going to make this a class and then you typed ID.
No, if I said we're going to make it a class, I meant ID.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because in here, we're doing query selector.
Okay.
And, right, we're using this hashtag, this £. If it was an ID, I could do dot. I mean, a class, I could use dot. Since it's an ID, I'm going to go with this hash here.
Okay, cool.
Let's see if this is working for us. Go back to Google Chrome here. Let's look at our index.html file. Nice. We have our syllabus. If we recall, this app is something I've been wanting to build for myself ever since graduating college. I've been making my own syllabi for things I want to study. One of those things is West African art history. So that's our first syllabi that was seeded in the database. This app is cool. It's fine, right? We're rendering some data. We finally connected our API to our front end. A lot has happened. If you've been in previous project builds, I typically would like create a new branch, right? And then merge this. But for the sake of time, I'm just going to build this all on the master branch. If you are working on your project, I talk about this in the order of operations guide. Where is that? There we go. So I talk about that here, where when creating your GET request, go ahead and where do I put that? And merge to the master branch, right? Create a new branch for your GET implementation. I definitely recommend doing this just to get in the habit of building features on different branches and keeping your master, keeping the integrity of your master, only ever having working code on the master branch. But since we only have an hour and a half to build a single page application, I'm kind of breaking that rule here. But let's kind of review what happened. We created a GET function to make a call to our index endpoint in our API. And we put that GET function in the DOM content event listener. So that was our first step here. We first made sure that we could trigger some JavaScript once the DOM content was loaded. For us, that was console logging. And then we decided, okay, it's working, it's loaded, everything's looking good. I'm gonna go ahead and fetch my data in here. And then we were like, okay, we can refactor this though. We don't wanna do all of our code in DOM content loaded. So we created this GET syllabi function. And in here is where we're doing all of that beautiful fetching. And we kind of have this very, very, very pretty markup HTML just sitting in the middle of our fetch request. If we have a little bit of more time later in the session, I really, really would like to refactor this. And in order to refactor this, we're going to create a render function that we're going to be able to use for both our GET and our post. But for now, this totally works here. What we're doing is we're iterating over the JSON data that we got back from our API for each syllabus. We're kind of like rendering this syllabus card here, which shows the image URL, the title, category name, this button. And we're kind of just appending it updating the inner HTML and appending it to our syllabus container div that we have created in our HTML file. Anyone have any questions about this whole entire flow? Before we move on to our post request, again, if we think about that mantra, when some event happens, when the DOM content loads, I want to make what kind of fetch, a get request, and I want to manipulate the DOM in what way. I want to iterate over that response, and I want to actually show that data to the user in a div, which gets us this. Any questions so far?
I have a question.
Yes.
Okay, I just couldn't understand the attribute dot, why you go through the attributes, because is it how you have it on your JSON file?
That's exactly right. So if you remember what we were just talking about, I'm gonna, just to show y'all what I'm doing here. Implemented. Yeah, so if we go back to, again, this is why I mentioned, like, I love having a tab open that has our JSON data already in it, because this kind of shows us how our data is nested, right? So this first key in our response is called data. The data key is how we actually get to our array here. But then in that actual array, there's a key called attributes, which has our title, our description, and our image URL, right? So if I were to go into my index file and in here, let's say, let's put a debugger in here. Syllabi.data is my array, but we're for eaching over each individual syllabus object. Let's actually see what that looks like in the browser. Cool, so I'm gonna refresh this. We hit our debugger as expected. Let's see what syllabus is. Syllabus is my single syllabus object, but how do I get to this title? I can't, like, could I do, can't do that, because there is no title key on this syllabus object. I can do syllabus.id.
Attributes, no?
Yeah, it would be attributes. So the question is, you know, why do we need attributes? This is the exact reason, because the attributes object is what is storing all of these attributes. It's storing the title, it's storing the description, the image URL, and even our category object. So in here, I can do syllabus attributes, right? And if I wanted the title, I would do .title. What if I wanted the category? What would I do here? If I wanted the category, how would I access that? If I want the category name. What would I type in my console? Go ahead.
Attributes.category.name.
That's exactly right. So because my category associated object is nested as well, I would have to do syllabus.attributes.category, which will give me that whole entire category object back. I want to show that to the user, I would do .name. So some folks do not like Fast.json API for this exact reason. But as your application grows larger, this sort of like fine specificity actually becomes super, super advantageous and helpful. And it organizes your data in a way that just actually becomes kind of soothing. Does this help answer your question, Sonar?
Yes, thank you.
Cool, cool, of course. All right, so we have just completed the first feature, our GET request. But now let's go ahead and move on to our post, right? It's cool to be able to read some data, but I want to be able to actually create some data as well. So this whole piece is done. But now we're moving on to our post requests. Again, if you're following along in this build, please create a new branch for your post implementation. But for us, in the interest of time, I'm just going to go ahead and start moving forward with creating a form. Currently, if we look at our HTML, it's only this div, only this container. It's fine, it's cute, but I need to eventually have a form in here if I want to get some data from the user. And again, yes, William just posted JSON Awesome in the chat. So feel free to click on that link so we don't lose it once this meeting's over. And y'all also feel free to use the JS Project Build Slack channel as well if y'all see any other resources that appear as you build this out. But again, I have some form code in my part 3 notes. I do not want to excite y'all by watching me just type some HTML. I know that is so exciting. So I am going to just copy and paste that over here. And then we're going to walk through it just like we did previously. I'm going to fix my indentation here. That looks better-ish. Okay. No, that needs to be in a little bit more. And then that, okay. So what we have here is I have a div called form container. This is right above my syllabus container div. And in this form, I am basically just taking in all of the endpoints that I need for a user to create a syllabus. First input is going to be title. Second input is going to be, or text area, I should say, is going to be description. Because the syllabus is going to be the description's a little bigger, I did text editor instead of input. And then the third input is going to be input URL, is the ID I gave it. This is where the user is going to put in the image URL for their syllabus. Finally, I am using a select to grab the category that is going to be associated with the syllabus. So if we remember from part 2, no, probably part 1, when we built this out, right, a syllabus belongs to a category, which means it has a category foreign key on that syllabus table. So we can actually, since our backend is right here, we can collapse some of this stuff. Can actually look at the schema. Right, so the our syllabus table wants a category ID along with the title, description, image URL. Created at and updated at get created automatically so that we don't actually need the user to type that information in. Our API creates that data for us automatically or saves that data automatically. But again, we'll need that category ID to create that associated syllabus, that associated category for our new syllabus. And in order to do that, I am using the select tag and giving it options. I'm wrapping the option tags around the text that's actually going to be displayed by the user. And I'm giving it a value based on the ID in my backend. this is going to be super, super inefficient as my, as I create the functionality. Let's say I created the functionality in the future for a user to be able to create a category. This won't work anymore, right? I'll have to do this form in JavaScript. I couldn't do it in my HTML, but again, since we're building a single page application in an hour and a half, this totally works. And the value is important because in order to create the syllabus, I'm going to need the category ID to associate it with. I know I have 3 categories in my database. So if I, just like I did localhost API v1 syllabuses, I can do localhost categories. And I can see category 1 is art, category 2 is tech, category 3 is science. This is seeded data in my backend. So I know that these IDs are reliable as long as my seed data doesn't really change here. Again, now like what may happen if we reseed, these IDs may get a little wonky, which is why we have this destroy all at the top here.
Oh yeah, no.
Yeah.
I don't want to take up too much time on this because it might just be an aside, but I'm wondering when you're making your forms,
Yeah.
is it better practice maybe just to make a card for the form itself with JavaScript in totality, or is it better practice to have the form partially built in HTML and then the elements like the categories that you're indicating that need to be built in JavaScript, add those in?
Yeah, so with experience, it has always just been better to build as much HTML as you can in JavaScript. Doing the create element and appending and appending and appending. Granted, it may lead to very long JavaScript functions, but a lot of times if your app has a lot of asynchronous behavior where, like, I think Christina is, I don't know if Christina's in here, but she's doing kind of a modal situation. And I believe we may have run into something similar where her form wasn't available yet on the DOM until she clicked this button. That was the functionality she wanted. I think Renika is doing something similar where she wants to render the form based on certain methodology, based on an event. Stuff like that really becomes super helpful if your form is being kind of built out in the JavaScript, right? Okay. Of course, that's a really good question. Always like, inner HTML versus do we actually build the JavaScript? What do we add in our HTML file versus what do we add in JavaScript? If I had more time, I would definitely be putting this in a function somewhere, like you said, kind of creating some form card. That's an excellent question.
Thank you.
Of course. Christina and Renika are in the chat, just laughing.
That and used like hide classes,
yeah,
by the JavaScript because I'm using another framework. And it's just easier to see what's on the page when you're building it. And will I be penalized?
No. So this is the thing, y'all, we are building MVP JavaScript applications. Most of the stuff we're talking about, like, we're not, unless you're building a very dense and dynamic JavaScript app, you may not run into issues with what we're talking about, right? So rendering something like this, having some inner HTML in your code, like, no one's going to be like that. Like, no one's going to say that because this application is, it's going to be no more than 100 lines, right? Having some HTML in your HTML file is totally fine, but we run into issues once this gets bigger. So what we're talking about is really talking about scaling up the application. Once it gets to a certain scale, our decisions are going to look a lot different. But at this scale, we're totally fine to do things like this. Cool. I got some excellent questions. All right, so let's go ahead and refresh this page and let's see if our form made it. And it did. Look at that form. It's so fancy. Have you seen a fancier application? So we now have we have a title, we have a description, we have like a input for our image URL, and then we also have our little select that has art, tech, and science, our categories here. I could make this better and do something that says like choose a category. But we now have a form on our DOM here. Choose category, and then I'm gonna close that p tag. If I can type it. Okay, cool. So we're now choosing a category, and then let's also kind of add some line breaks after that form. All right, so we now like have a form for actually creating a syllabus, but now we have to actually make a post request to create that syllabus. And just fair warning, y'all, we are going to go over time. It's already 12:22 here. So if you have to jet, totally understand. This video will be available in the channel. Kind of had a feeling this would happen. But I do want y'all to see this second example of a post request, because right, the project requirements are at least 2 different requests. So after I build this post request, I will basically have a project that has all of the project requirements except OOJS, which we'll talk about in part 4. Yes, the JS project build Slack channel. If you are not in there, if you are not in that Slack channel, please Slack me or anyone else who is in the Slack channel. Most folks in here are. We'll go ahead and add you if you're not in there already. But cool. We have a form, but our form doesn't really do anything yet, right? Like we've given it an ID, but we're not really listening to it. We're not able to accept any data from it yet. So what would I want to implement in here to actually be able to get access to some of this data? What do I want to do in my code? What will be the first step?
You want an object to pass along with the fetch.
Yes. But before I do that, right, I need to get that data from the user, right? Eventually, I'm going to send an object back to that post request. But first, I need to like actually get that syllabus form. Like I need to actually like get that data. Which
variables.
Yes, we need to create some variables in here. And if we were
things
right, the setup stuff. But if we remember our JS mantra, right? I want, when some event happens, I want to make what kind of fetch and manipulate the DOM in what way. You're on the what kind of fetch part. But first we need to say, okay, when some event happens, when a submit event happens on our create form, right? But before we do that, we need to first actually query for that form, get that form back, I believe. I'm not even gonna guess. Okay, cool. Yeah, this is what it was, what I thought it was. I'm gonna create or copy that. Always good to copy those because we will misspell it most of the time. Or I should say I will misspell it most of the time. Cool. So I'm now getting that syllabus form. On that syllabus form, as like we said, if we remember our mantra, when some event happens, when this submit event happens. So I want to add an event listener, and I want to specifically be listening for the submit here. And what I like to do always, and before we even do this, we can just console log. Actually, let's actually do that. So let's pass it, that event. We may not. So let's see what this does. Oh, right. I probably need another. Okay, that looks better. All right. Let's see what happens. Whenever I add an event listener, my first step is to console log, because I don't want to move forward at all before I've confirmed that this event actually hooked up properly.
I think you're missing a parentheses where you have the.
Nice.
Because that one's referring to the DOM content loaded. So I think it's before.
Oh, y'all are so right. Okay, so I borrowed this from here. But what I actually want to do is close this here.
Also,
yeah.
Do you?
I think I know what you're about to say.
Do you need to call event prevent default?
Yes, I will. But let's see what happens if I don't.
Okay.
Yeah. You're totally on it. All right, so let's do title, description, just some test stuff in here to get this going. Right? Did y'all see that? It's like I'm able to submit that form, but my page is automatically refreshing. So that means what we need to do, just like Meg alluded to, is we're going to want to prevent that event default. This is talked about at length in the curriculum, but if some folks want to review it, drop that in the chat and I can make sure we talk about this in part 4. But we're going to want to create some sort of event handler that is going to prevent that default functionality. So I'm going to do create form handler. That's what I'm going to call this. I'm going to pass it the event, and I'm going to create that form down below. These little zoom bars. All right, so I think I called it, create form handler. We're going to accept that event here. And then just as Meg said, we need to prevent the default behavior here. And now we should be able to actually see if this is hooked up properly. Let me make sure I can see all my code. Bring that up a little bit. So what I've done is in here, I'm passing it this event handler. So this is our listener, right? We're listening here. But here is where we're going to actually handle I don't want to say handle that event because that's not true, but kind of in here, this form handler is where I'm going to handle that form, those inputs that I'm getting from that form. And I'm really getting these inputs because that submit event has happened. So this is kind of our handler for our event here. Let's save this and let's see. This is coming through finally. Nice. So that handler is working. Our event prevent default is working. We're moving right along. Because if you think about that mantra again, right? When some event happens, I want to make what kind of fetch? When a submit event happens, right? So we did that first piece, that first tier is done. Now we want to move on to, I want to make what kind of fetch, right? That's the question. I want to make a post request. If we remember our verbs, we have get, post, patch, put, delete. For creating, it's post. So I'm going to ultimately want to make a post request. But before I do that, I need to actually be able to get some of the values on my form, there are multiple ways to do this. We could probably even use form data, which is available in HTML5. But what I also like doing is just getting the values of our inputs. What do I mean when I say that? Let's go ahead and put a debugger in. Form data is cool too. I'm not going to lie. So let's refresh this page, and I'm going to do title, description, image here, just so we can hit our debugger. I'm going to choose the category tech. Nice. On that submit, we hit our debugger. How can I capture the values of these inputs here? What can I type in here?
Syllabus?
Like this?
Okay, maybe not.
Yeah, so we don't have a variable called syllabus yet. There's somebody in the chat, e.target.dataset. Let's try that. So because there isn't a data set on, so we can use data set, let's say,
I think she's on something with e.target though.
Yes. So because this is a form, if we do e.target, right, we see our form. So we get our form here.
Oh, so it's the target of the form. The form is the submit button is the target, I guess, right?
Well, right, and the submit button is listening to the whole entire form. I want to talk about what Sushi just mentioned with data set. So we can use, let me actually go back to index.js so we can see what div. So in here where we have our div on line 18, data-id, I could call data set. If I were to query for this element, I could call data set on this. I would get that DOM string map that we saw in the browser. That would give me kind of like this object where I would have ID in it, and I could get that ID. So we really use data set to kind of like put data onto HTML elements and be able to access that using our query selector. But what I can do for right now, multiple ways to do this, as I said, but what I can do is I can query for these inputs and get their values. I see something else in the chat, e.target.value. Okay, let's try that. So we're close, y'all. We're close. We definitely want the value. What I'm going to do is I am going to query for this, this title attribute, right? So I have on my input title, I have input title. So in here, I could do document that query selector or get element by ID. Query selector is a little bit more preferred. And then we can do input title. This will give me that input of this first title. And then on that, I can do dot value, and that will give me its value. So there's a couple of ways to do this. What are your form variable names? So my variable name for my form is, I think, create form or something like that, that I established in my DOM content listener. But I can get the values of these individual inputs. I can do the same thing for my category dropdown, where I'm listening. I'm going to first search the document, right, for that ID. I think it's called categories, right? This is going to return my select. Each one of these options has values, if we remember, right? So I can do that value to see which one the user ultimately selected. I selected tech, so this is correct. I only can do this though after that submit event has happened, right? Because before that, I won't have access to the values of these attributes, which is why I created that form handler and pass that into my submit event. This form handler is where I'm going to be grabbing all of the values for my inputs. Anyone have any questions about how we did this? Let me look at the chat. No worries, that was before. Okay.
I have a question actually.
Yeah, for sure.
You could still, like, if your form was just there in the HTML and you weren't rendering it in JavaScript, you could still grab the elements, but just not the values, like the actual DOM elements, and then like assign those to variables, and then basically call the values.
Yep, yep. I think, so what I'm going to do is I've already written a lot of this out, again, in the notes. So I'm going to paste that here, and I'm going to ask you if this is what you mean. So I'm going to replace my debugger, bring this up a little bit so y'all can see, with what I just did in the console, where I'm looking at my input title, I'm going to grab the value. I'm looking at input description, I'm going to grab the value. Even though it's a text editor, I should probably update that. I'm going to look at my input URL, I'm going to grab the value, and I'm going to do the same thing for category. Is this what you were talking about, Sushi?
Yeah, what I was saying was that if you didn't, like, I was saying, like, if you just wanted to get all your DOM element grabbing out of the way at the beginning when you're building, then you could just
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
Input dot value, since you've already defined the variable.
Right. So I could just like pop all this here and take away value, and
yeah,
and then call that down here.
Yeah, I was just asking if that's okay, because then you could have them as globals.
Yeah, you can definitely do that. I try to shy away from global variables as much as possible, especially when I only care about certain values after certain actions, right? So I only care about these input values after this submit has been triggered, right? So I don't need to make those inputs globally accessible to everyone at all times, right? So I'm only kind of keeping these inputs in the scope of my form handler. If in the future I want to like reuse these inputs for multiple reasons, or reuse a form for multiple reasons, then it would make sense to make them global. But that many variables globally, when I really only care about it in one function, makes sense to keep it in a function.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had a similar question to Sushi, and like I think you answered that, but like just I guess for the whole project in general, like I've seen a lot of people from study sessions have like this on DOM content loaded at the top, and then they define a bunch of variables right away.
Yeah, yeah.
Is that like kind of something that you would not encourage, that you think they should be encapsulated within functions?
Well, so if you need certain variables as soon as the DOM loads, put them in DOM content loaded, right? For sure. But we only need those variables after someone hits submit, right? So what we're doing here is just very, very, very indicative, or like kind of tethered to this event listener. So
Yeah, basically you only have that form.
Right.
With yours.
Yeah. I need this form to be available on the DOM as soon as it loads.
Yeah.
Right. Like I want access to that as soon as the DOM loads. So then that way, as soon as someone starts using it and they hit submit, right, like that event listener is attached properly. And in there is where I actually handle the data. And that's what I do here. I'm really only using the event to prevent the default functionality. If I was just like listening, if I just had like an input, right, I could do event.target.value. But because all I have is that input. But because I like clicked on an entire form, I want to get all of the values in that form. And again, like we can use something like form data, which does this as well. But I think this is like super, super intuitive and straightforward, whereas like form data kind of abstracts a lot of things.
Okay.
Cool. Good questions, y'all. So I have a form handler, but there's something I want to do. And I'm also gonna, I think the next time I do this project build, I think I'm gonna do a GET request and a POST request in 2 separate study group sessions. But for the folks who are still with us, we're going on 2 hours. Thank you for hanging in there. But so we now have these values, we're getting these values. But this category input, this value of this category input, we're ultimately capturing an ID here. But right now it's a string. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna create another variable here called category ID. And I'm going to parse the category input into an integer. Because this is what I ultimately want. I want the category ID. I really don't care about the string. I really want the category ID. I could also put this all on one line, but I'm not going to. So, right, this is kind of 2 different things. I could wrap parse int around this whole thing and then make category ID. I may just do that actually, now that I said it out loud. It's just a lot of shit happening on one line. Okay, cool. So the category ID is being parsed using it's kind of like input value, it's selection value. And in here is where I'm actually going to create my function, right? We've done all this and we still have not gotten to that post request, right? So a lot of steps here, but in this function is where I'm going to ultimately be making my post request to the backend. But in order to do that, right, I need this data. So I'm going to pass it the title. I'm going to pass it the description. I'm going to pass it the image. And that category ID. In here, I can just do title, description, image URL, yeah. And category ID. And instead of category ID, camel case, I'm going to do snake case, and I'll let you in on why in just a second. But yeah, I can name these arguments whatever I want, as long as they are in the same order when I have originally called this function. I'm going to console log these and pause for questions in case anyone has any. I also have been coding a lot and I have not committed a thing. So again, if you are watching this, do not do what I am doing as far as GitHub is concerned. But I'm really only doing all of operating like this for the sake of time. Yes, I'm very, very bad, Meg. This is all kinds of lines without any commits. And again, I'm thinking about doing this may be a 5-part project build where one part is just the GET request and the initial setup, and the next part is the post and all that. And in there, I'll actually be able to do some best practices as far as Git's concerned. But I am in that post. I'm in that post fetch, and here I want to pause for questions. Does anyone have any questions about A, that's the mid-event listener, right? B, how we're getting the inputs, how we're getting that data that the user typed in? Any questions about that before we move on to actually building out our post request here?
Actually, it's not a question, but I'm also confused about how the Meg and Sushi mentioned about the global variable. Then we are going to query selector. So it's also, I'm not really 100% clear about it, because the normally which we learn, maybe you are trying something different here, but always this query selector on the top, and we are going and grabbing to variable, and we are manipulating the function from there. So right now it's the other way. So it's a little bit like, looks confusing for me.
Yeah, that's totally real, and that is valid, right? I'm doing things different than what y'all may have seen in other examples and labs and other projects. And again, this goes back to what I said in the beginning, because it's JavaScript, there are so many ways we can do this. And ultimately these design decisions, quote unquote, like they are decisions that you can make as a developer. So there are some developers who just want all of their query selectors up at the top. Everything, anytime they're querying the DOM, they want all of those selectors in DOM content loaded, or they want them globally. I don't, right? That's just me. And ultimately, y'all are going to be able to make this decision in your application, right? For me, logically, it makes the most sense to only like select something when I need it, right? So after this form is submitted, it is calling a form handler. In that form handler is the only time at this point in which I'm going to need the values from this form, right? So I don't really need to query for these inputs when the DOM content loads, because I don't care about these inputs when the DOM content loads. I don't care about it yet. I don't need to make these variables and query for these selectors globally, because I'm not like reusing these variables in multiple places in my code. With this endpoint variable, I want this to be global, because I'm going to use this variable in my post request in this function here. But my global scope does not need to know about all these variables, and I also don't need these variables available to me when the DOM content loads. If you would like them to be available to you, and this is for everybody, then you can make those decisions. But I kind of think about, like, when does this matter? When do I care? You know, and being thoughtful and intentional about scope, right? Like, I wouldn't get into the habit of making things globally scoped just to make sure I have access to them, or for whatever reason people do it. I would select things when I need them, right? And that's what I'm doing in this form handler. There's no right and wrong way. Ultimately with JavaScript, my mantra is like Tim Gunn, make it work, or whatever he says, get to work, make it work. I think he says, like, that's the first thing you can do with JavaScript. And then with JavaScript's beautiful because you can refactor it 100 times, right? But in the beginning, make it work, do what feels most comfortable to you, and then go back and refactor that to something that may feel a little bit more comfortable or be a little bit more efficient. But there's multiple ways to do JavaScript. It is not like Ruby where there's kind of like a hard and fast way.
No, I'm not judging. It's just
Yeah, of course.
surprising because you learn something in your mind and you see something different.
Yeah.
And oh, what is that right
Oh
now?
my goodness. Wait until you graduate. Wait until you graduate and you join a dev team and you're like, what is happening in this code? Oh my goodness. Yeah.
Please don't get offended. I just
Oh no, of course not. Of course not. I'm never offended by anything y'all say. I know it's just curiosity and just questions, but I only said everything I just said because there's multiple ways to do different things and y'all are going to see different ways of doing it. If you've been to my ToyTel lectures, you see that I think I have that code here. Is it in here where I'm like literally, no, it's not this one. It's woof woof. I do a different lecture where in here, literally everything is in DOM content loaded. DOM content loaded is here.
Yeah.
All of my code is in here. I would not do that today.
But it also depends. Do you think it's also depends to the application, like how the concept of the application? That's why you are also doing that, or right?
No, this is just old me coding.
Okay.
Right. This is like just old self. But it works. It totally works. Cool. Great questions. I do want to make sure we get to this post fetch, and then for folks who are still hanging out, just like clenching their chairs for the post fetch, I'll do that, and then we'll open it up for more questions, and folks can leave if they have to dip out. But I don't want to hold the folks who are kind of like waiting for the finale here, which is our post requests. When some event happens, our submit event happens, I want to make what kind of fetch? Our post. And in order to do that, the syntax is a little different if we recall, right? So if we do using fetch, that MDM article will pop right up, and we can see how it's going to be a little different based on what method we're using. There's a couple of things we need. We need a method, headers, and body. Again, if we had some more time, I would actually type this out. But again, this is in the part 3 notes. So I am just going to grab that and walk through it through kind of step by step here. So yeah, all right, we did that part. All right, so I'm just gonna grab this. I'm just gonna grab the whole thing. Actually, no. I'm trying to figure out where it ends and where it begins. I think right here. Yeah, okay. So I'm gonna paste this fetch in here, and I am going to walk through it with y'all. So there's a couple of things happening. We know we're getting all these arguments because we console logged. But if we remember our previous fetch, right, we're still using that same endpoint, because if we look at our Rails routes for post, this is the endpoint. Post and index kind of share the same endpoint, but different routes, right? Different verbs, different routes, or different verbs, different action methods, right? So if we were to look at our backend, our controller here, API V1 syllabus, create. This is the route we're going to hit because we are using that post method. So Rails is going to route us to this method here. If I were to look at my Rails routes, I would see that that route would be the same, but that verb, that method would be different, be a post. And I'm making that explicit here. So I'm using the same endpoint, but I'm using the method post because it's a post request. I'm sending a post request to my API. I need this headers attribute being explicit about the content type here. But this is kind of one of the most important pieces. The method's super important too, but the body is how we're actually going to send that data. I have it as body data right now, but you can also kind of send it back like this, right? Title is going to be title, right? Description is going to be description. And remember, I'm looking at my arguments here, right? And I'm kind of creating this object that I'm going to send to my database based on the attributes that my API wants. It wants a title, it wants a description, wants an image URL, and a category ID to create a new syllabus. So in here, where I can do title, description, image URL here, image URL, and I could also do category ID here, category ID. So this will send back that data to my API. If I went to my controller and let's say I put a buy bug here, I should see that when we're ready to make that call. So I'm stringifying that JSON data in order to send it. And then I'm passing it an object that is going to have the key of title and the actual title value that we're passing this function from our create form handler that we got from the user. Dot then response, parsing that response to JSON. And then I want to actually console log that response. I want to see what that looks like. See if that was created properly. What is this for? Okay, that's fine. And we can get rid of all this space here. Any questions about this, the shape of this post request here before I actually test this out? Cool. Go ahead.
I had a question. Why don't you have the accept header in there?
So you're talking about this kind of like there's another, I could do another header here called accepts.
Yeah.
I don't.
Looking at Toytail, and they had us put that in for that lab.
Yeah, so it's optional. So yeah, I could have a headers object and I could have accepts. And I think it will only, I think if you want to accept JSON, that is totally optional, something we don't have to do, but you may see it in the code. So yeah, in Toytail, I believe there is that in the post? Okay, yeah, it's in the patch here. I could do this too. It will work without it.
Okay.
Yeah, it's an extra layer of like you only accepting JSON back. I believe I can look more into what that accepts header is actually going to do for us.
Oh.
But yeah, I do know it's optional.
Okay, because I have it in my post and my patch, but maybe I messed that up.
No, keep it. No, it's good to have. It's just not necessary.
Okay.
Yeah. Cool. So, all right, we're console logging that syllabus that we get back. And remember, we have a pry in our create route. So hopefully we hit that pry if we set all of this up correctly. So we're just going to do title. Let's just do test. Title. Description. Image. I want to do like, so you guys know that it's from the front end. I'm going to do just JS in front of all of this. And then I'm going to give it tech and create that syllabus. And in my backend, I have now hit my buy bug, right? Because I sent a post request to that route of my Rails API, which is connected to my create action method, right? My create method. So in here, I could look at what my syllabus params are, right? That I'm getting from strong params. And this looks good. Title, JS description, JS image, category ID.
We can't see what you're looking at.
Oh no. There we go.
Cool.
All right, so y'all can see, y'all should be able to see this now. I'm in BuyBug online. I hit it on line 17. And right, I looked at what my syllabus params are, and I see that this is all data that I got from my front end that the user gave me. So this is looking good. I always recommend, even though you're building a JS project, you've also built a Rails API. So you should be debugging both applications at all times, or like, you know, checking to make sure your data is what you think it is in both places at all times. So I'm going to get rid of that buy bug here, and we're going to try to do this officially. I also think we probably rightfully so got an error. Exactly. Got a little error here. And that's just because we had a buy bug in there, so I wasn't able to finish that, that procedure. All right, get rid of toy tail. Console logging syllabus. So let's actually, now that the buy bug's out, let's actually try to do this. So title, description, image, and tech. This is looking good. This is looking good. That was a successful post request. We checked the network tab. This post request is returning a 202 as accepted. We are on the right track. We just did that post request. So if we look back at our code, we went from our submit event. When some event happens, a submit event, I want to make what kind of fetch? A post fetch. But then we have that third piece. I want to manipulate the DOM in what way? Before we do that, I want to show y'all a little trick where we can actually kind of build the body data outside of the body itself here. And because if y'all notice, my keys are the same as my values here. Title, description, image URL, category ID. What I can do is just do title, just do description, just do image URL, and just do category ID. In JavaScript, if they are, this is probably the same in some other languages too, but if the key and the value are the same, you only need that one, and it will still work. So you see what I did here? Because it's title, description, image URL, I only just need to put one, and it is going to assume, okay, both are the equivalent or translating as the same thing. It's going to say, okay, image URL is the value, but it's also the key. So we don't need to repeat ourselves, which is nice. Which is why I specifically named my arguments this way instead of how I named them up here on line 38. So now I could refactor this. Again, remember, just like we said, there's going to be so many ways we can refactor things in JavaScript. But now I can just pass it this whole entire object, and this will work in the exact same way. And I can kind of like build body object outside of my fetch. Cool. All right, so we're at the tail end. The last thing we want to do is render that data. When some event happens, that submit event, I want to make what kind of fetch, a post fetch, manipulate the DOM in what way. I want to show that data to the user. They need to see what data they just created. If we look at the syllabus object, as we remember, it's a little different than our get, right? Now data isn't pointing to an array, it's pointing to a single object. So the way in which we manipulate the DOM in this instance is going to look a little different. Before, data was pointing to an array. Now data is pointing just directly to that attributes object here. So what we're going to do here is what I'm doing, I'm going to take this console log out, and what I'm doing is just doing syllabus.data, so I can just get that data object. And I'm going to do syllabus.data.attributes.image URL. And this is all going to be the same, but now on this syllabus data object. What I could have also done is just done this, but that's too much, right? Like that's just too far. So we just kind of shortened that on line 53 so we could just save ourselves. We could also do dot attributes here as well, right? So I could also do dot attributes and then get rid of all of that. And then again, same as before, I'm selecting my container and then I am updating the inner HTML. So this is because I'm using this in two places. This is something I may want to make a global variable, but as I mentioned, I'm going to refactor this in session 4. I totally underestimated how long this is going to take. So in session 4, I'll go through how we can basically refactor this into, where is my notes here? Markdown preview, all the way to the bottom. So in here, right, I can like refactor this so that I have a render function that takes on the syllabus and does that markup stuff. So I'm not repeating myself in both fetch requests. And in the refactor, we're going to also create a syllabus class and do a lot of this there as well. But for the time being, submit event, post request, manipulate the DOM in this way. Now, let's go ahead and for the final test here, let's see if we got this working. I'm going to clear this, refresh. See the syllabus front end image. Oh, okay, so that actually did go through here. So we're going to ignore that for now. Create a syllabus. Who are we? Let's study Missy Elliott. I've been wanting.
I love her.
Oh my gosh, what an icon, right? So I've been meaning to create a Missy Elliott syllabus because I just feel like I need to study Missy Elliott. So For all of those who do not know,
I'm going to enroll in your class, Anna.
Right?
Classmates.
Yeah.
Missy Elliott 101.
Right. They have PhD programs on Beyonce. Why can't we do Missy Elliott as well? So we're just gonna do choose study in icon. All right. I mean, she's art, tech, and science, but we can only choose one. So Missy Elliott, study in icon. We gave her an image here. Let's go ahead and create that syllabus and see what happens. That's from the other one. There we go. And there she is. She was appended to the DOM. She made it there. And she kind of went through this whole process with us where we went from having a submit event to like handling that form data to making a post request that allows us to then render that data to the user. So that's our whole arc here. Y'all, this was 2 hours. So if you are still here, if you're watching this video, thank you for sticking along with us. I know we've been here and been at it for a while. Again, in future project builds, we are going to break this up because I hate to keep y'all sitting here listening to me talk for 2 hours straight. So lesson learned for me, I'm gonna break this up just so we have enough time for all of y'all's questions. And we have enough time for refactors, but I wanna make sure before we go, save me a lot of headaches. I'm happy this was helpful for y'all, even though it was 2 hours and also some people watching. Sorry for this 2-hour video, but I do have a couple more minutes. So does anyone have any questions about kind of everything we've done before we go?
I had a quick question on the query selector.
Yeah, yes. Let's go back to that.
Yeah, so at the very top, you had, I think it was like create syllabus form.
Yeah.
And then when you, in the post fetch, when you have your, or no, it's when you're, oh yeah, in the form handler, you have these different inputs. So you have document query select, input title. Can you call create post form dot query select input title? Like, can you?
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Create syllabus form, that's what it is. Like, can you call query select on an element? Because
yes, you can.
there's times where I try to do that and it doesn't work. And then there's times where it does. And I just get confused about that.
Yeah, so I believe it's based on the name. So if we look at this form, it has the name of title. This input has the name of title. This input has the name of description, or this text area has the name of description. If I remember this correctly, we can access it through the name. What is that? I'll just do image. What did I name image URL?
So I'm saying, like, if you did create syllabus form dot query selector and then passed in input, like hash input URL.
So yeah, that's what I'm doing online. That's what I'm doing here.
Well, you're doing document.query selector.
On the whole document, yeah.
I'm asking, can you do it on just the form?
Oh, for sure. I think, actually, let's see. I know there's a way we can get child elements, but all right. So you're saying I first have this syllabus form. I think,
So you should be able to access create syllabus form right now.
right, because the DOM's loaded. All right, create syllabus form, right? So I have that variable, and then you're saying on that variable, on the syllabus form, where are we? Can I query for,
Yeah.
So that looks like it works. Probably because it's a form, it's a parent element.
Yeah.
So the input is nested within the form. And I know, like, you know, the DOM's just a tree. The document's up at the top, and then we have like divs, and then the divs have children, or the form, and the div child is a form, and then the form children is inputs. So really, like, the DOM is a tree, and I think if we query on the parent for one of its children, you can access it. But document is, you know, pretty handy.
Ultimate.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I feel like, okay, I must, because I know I've done it before and it hasn't worked, and it must be something to do with scoping or something, because
And maybe it wasn't a parent. Maybe it was on the same level.
yeah.
You needed to go up to the document.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, cool. Thank you.
That was a good question. Of course, of course. All right, y'all, I'm going to stop sharing. Look at these, like, last, I don't want to say soldiers, but, you know, last folks here. Let me go ahead and stop recording just